Hello there, everyone. Welcome to the World of Momos podcast. And on this episode of History and Mythology, we have the summarized story of King Alfred and England. So let's get into it. Alfred, born in 849 AD, was a king of Wessex, a Saxon kingdom in southwestern England. He prevented England from falling to the Danes and promoted learning and literacy. When he was born, it must have been seemed unlikely that Alfred would become king, since he had 4 older brothers. He said that he never desired royal power. Perhaps a scholar's life would have contented him. His mother early aroused his interest in English poetry, and from his boyhood he also hankered after Latin learning, possibly stimulated by visits to Rome in 853 and 855. It is possible also that he was aware of and admired the great Frankish king Charlemagne, who had at the beginning of the century revived learning in his realm. He probably received the military education normal for a young man of rank during his early years. He first appeared on active service in 868 AD when he and his brother King Ethelred went to help Burgred of Mercia against a great Danish army that had landed in East Anglia in 865 and taken possession of Northumbria in 867 AD. The Danes refused to give battle and peace was made. In this year, Alfred married Elswith, descendant through her mother from Mercian kings. Late in 871 AD, the Danes invaded Wessex, and Ethelred and Alfred fought several battles with them. Although Alfred has been called the founder of the English nation, he never ruled over all of England. However, his work enabled his successors to finish the task of uniting England under the House of Wessex. Among his many reformations, he carried out economic reformations. Alfred reformed his coinage to bring the silver content back up to acceptable standards, to help give economic stability after the chaos of the invasion. This was important because trust in the coinage relied on its precious metal value. The adversity. By 868 AD, Alfred was recorded as having fought alongside his brother Ethelred, fighting what was proving to be a constant threat of attack from the Danes. 2 years later, at the Battle of Murton in March 871 AD, Alfred and his brother suffered a serious defeat by the Danes. His brother, the king, died a month later, and Alfred was left to rule as leader of the Saxon kingdom. In May at Wilton, Alfred and his Saxon army suffered another defeat. Sensing that they could not drive out the Danish invaders from their land, he was forced to make peace with them instead. This decision resulted in the Vikings temporarily withdrawing to London and subsequently occupying the majority of England for the next 5 years. By the year 876 AD, the Danes had regrouped and made their assault on Wessex. The occupation of Warham forced Alfred to negotiate a more permanent peace deal, a deal that disintegrated almost as soon as it was sealed. The conflict raged on, with Alfred making a strategic calculation to blockade Danish ships, forcing the Vikings to withdraw to Mercia. In January the following year, the Danes pushed ahead once more, attacking Chippenham, which at the time served as the royal household of Alfred the Great. The element of surprise meant that Alfred and his people were completely taken off guard, resulting in a high death toll and forcing the king and a small band of men into the nearby woods. The fight back. In the spring of the same year, Alfred and his remaining men managed to build a fort in the Somerset marshland at Athelney. Athelney was essentially an island in the marshes, an advantageous position away from the Danes, which bought Alfred enough time to rally together the local militia. Men came from nearby towns and villages to form a tight resistance movement. The conflict had begun to take on a guerrilla-style combat. These tactics ultimately proved to be successful. From his hidden position in the Somerset marshland, the king and his men tackled the Danes for 7 weeks. Alongside the skirmishing, Alfred was also assembling a formidable army which would soon go on to defeat the invaders at the Battle of Addington. This proved to be a decisive victory for the Saxon king, forcing the Danes to surrender and securing the baptism of their king Guthrum, with Alfred serving as his sponsor, and thus securing long-term peace. After this success, an agreement was negotiated by Alfred, known as the Danelaw. This was a treaty designed to divide England. The Danes were to take control of the north and east, with Alfred and the Anglo-Saxons taking Kent, West Mercia, and their original kingdom of Wessex. The reforms. Keen to reflect on where he and his army had previously fallen short, the Saxon king took time to challenge traditional army structures and introduce new methods to deal with the continuous threat from overseas. Building work took place, ensuring that the settlements across the southern England would be fortified against possible future invasions. These were known as burhs and formed a well-designed fortified settlement system extending across the north. Alfred also took tentative steps in establishing a navy to tackle the naval capacity of the Danes on the English coastline. As described in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, this proved successful as the ships were larger, steadier, and swifter in the water, using a design inspired by the Greek and Roman warships, which were designed as fighting ships with high sides, instead of low-sided vessels deemed fit only for navigation. In order to maintain a defense system with long-lasting effects, Alfred introduced a tax and conscription system. This was largely based on the productivity of a tenant's landholding. The Hide, as it was known, was the tenant's obligation to the community based on the quality of the land owned. The services provided by the landowner would be judged accordingly. The same principles of organization and structure were applied to the judicial system pioneered by Alfred, seeking a new law and order approach. Alfred insisted on judges with certain desirable qualities, such as being literate, having a sharp mind, a good education, and astute knowledge of the law. Another important step taken by Alfred was in his approach of unifying kingdoms that had previously operated separately. He commissioned the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a vital document for the time, which promoted the unification of England. Alfred's reforms and ideas were applied to the education system, developed during his reign. He placed much importance on translations from Latin to English in order to establish a wider array of books accessible for learning and intellectual pursuits. Furthermore, inspired by the example set by Charlemagne, he introduced court schools, a system providing a sound education not only for the nobility but also those with lesser status. The final push. His eldest daughter, Ethelfled, would lead the fight against the Vikings and lay the foundations for England. After her husband passed away in 911 AD, Ethelfled took over the governing of the kingdom of Mercia, becoming the Lady of the Mercians. She went on the offensive against the Vikings and over the coming years played a significant role in the conquest of Danelaw. The 5 boroughs would eventually fall, and York would change ownership a couple of times during the early 10th century. In 954 AD, Eric Bloodaxe, one of the most famous Vikings in history and the then king of Northumbria, was finally driven out of the region. Danelaw had officially come to an end. Although Danelaw was no more in England, the Vikings were far from done on English soil. They retreated, consolidated, and successfully conquered the country in the early 11th century. In 1013, Sven Forkbeard became the first Danish king of England. His son Canute the Great held the throne until he died in 1035. The Viking presence in England was finally ended in 1066 when an English army under King Harold defeated the last great Viking king, Harald Hardrada of Norway, at the Battle of Stamford Bridge near York. Alfred was never forgotten. His memory lived on through the Middle Ages and in legend as that of a king who won victory in apparently hopeless circumstances and a wise lawgiver. Some of his work were copied as late as the 12th century. Modern studies have increased knowledge of him, but have not altered in its essentials the medieval conception of a great king. And although he died on 26th of October 899 AD, before his successors finally pushing out the Vikings out of England. From unknown causes, he died, most probably caused by poor health experience early on in his life. Alfred left behind an extraordinary legacy, reforming the traditions and structure of early English society, maintaining peace in uncertain times, and introducing structure, judicial processes, and education, which left a considerable cultural impact on the generations that followed. And not to mention the idea of England and the completion of that idea that was eventually seen off by his successors. Without him, without his leadership, without his reforms, without his perseverance, there would have been no England.